I'm John Travis in Novato, California on the 9th of July, 2020, talking to Juanita Brown in Burnsville, North Carolina. And we're going to explore today who you are and why, and what led to your marvelous creation of the world, or discovery of the World Cafe, beginning with your earliest childhood experiences, where you were born. I know your grandmother had a lot to do with it, and let's dig in and find out the origins of your historic contributions.
Well, I think growing up in Miami, Florida, with a mom who was extremely engaged in community-related activities. My mom was a founder of the American Civil Liberties Union in Florida during the late 1950s, during the McCarthy period. And I think probably the ground for much of my life came in those early days.
Oh.
As a child, I was helping my mom on street corners, passing out flyers for political campaigns of various types. And then there was a seminal event that happened I think I was in the 11th grade at the time. My mom was very involved at that time as well with the NAACP and the earliest days of the civil rights movement, as well as the work in civil liberties that had begun during the McCarthy period. And Father Theodore Gibson, who was an African-American Episcopal minister, had been sent to jail by the Florida Un-American Activities Committee because he refused to give over the lists of the NAACP, and which was his right. It was a private organization, and it was an illegal request. But in any case, my mom decided, and my dad, that they would, on a Sunday afternoon, have a cocktail party to raise money for getting Father Gibson out of jail for his bail money. And he was very famous and well known in the African-American community, and also among many Anglos in South Florida for his pioneering work. And so my mom and dad had the party. They decided they would have it at the cocktail hour of 4 o'clock in the afternoon while it was still light outside. And to our home came both Anglo-Americans or white Americans and African-Americans, all dressed up in their Sunday best. And the word started going out in the neighborhood that we were going to be beginning that Negroes at the time, as the nomenclature was, although the language was much worse when they were calling the police, that there was going to be a riot in the neighborhood and that police better get there right away. And so the police came, and my mother, in her inimical style, said as they banged on the door, opened the door in her cocktail dress, and they said, "We heard there's going to be a riot here." And my mother said, "Gentlemen, come in. We'd be happy to have you have a drink with us. Does it look to you like we're having a riot here? It seems to me that we're having a cocktail party here." And my mother said, "And I'd like the name, who is the commanding officer among you?" And and whoever was the person in charge of that group of police that had come in several police cars said, "Well, I am, ma'am." And my mom said, "Well, then I would like to place you in charge of assuring that our guests are able to leave here safely with no issue. And I'm assigning you that task now." So the cocktail party did go on, but that evening, and we don't know to this day who it was, was either the Ku Klux Klan or the White Citizens Council or the John Birch Society, came as darkness was falling and began to burn a cross in the front of our yard. And fortunately, just as we were we were so shocked to see these flames and these people outside. They did not have hoods, but they were with sunglasses and, like dark, you couldn't see who they were. And just at that moment, one of those South Florida torrential rainstorms, the rains that come at that time of year, came and doused the flames. And to the day that my mom and dad sold that house, the remains of that charred cross were in the rafters of our garage. And that was a very significant event in my life. And I think many, 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 many years earlier, when I was in the second grade, I can recall another seminal incident as I now look back, when you say, okay, who created Juanita and what was the grounds for the World Cafe, was that I was in the second grade, and I remember our second grade teacher, Mrs. Johnson, was she was a very devout fundamentalist Christian. And I didn't have that language, of course, at the time in the second grade. And she talked a lot about God. And I asked one day, I raised my hand and I said, Mrs. Johnson, what color is God? And she was so angry. She took me right to the principal's office. She called my mother, we lived right down the street from Orchard Villa Elementary School. And she called my mom and she says, your child has disrupted our classroom and is being impudent and blah, 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 blah. Okay, my mother comes and I'm sitting there like terrified. I didn't even know what I had done. That was so horrible. And Mrs. Johnson was sitting here. The principal was sitting behind her desk, and my mother came and she sat down next to me. I was sitting there, and there was Mrs. Johnson, and my mom sat next to me, and Mrs. Johnson laid out the nature of my sin. And my mother looked at the principal, and she looked at Mrs. Johnson. She looked down at me. She looked back at Mrs. Johnson, and she said, and Mrs. Johnson, what color is God? And I think that's what got me very interested in the question of questions, right? And in feeling that questions were okay to ask. And
how did that episode end then?
Well, that episode ended with me being able to go back to my class, but my mother, when I got home, saying to me, now, at that time I was a Janie, she said, now Janie, she said, you need to know there are certain questions that might be difficult. You might get a response like that from some people, but just know that I believe in your questions.
Uh-huh.
Even though not everyone will. And so
how was the rest of the year with Mrs. Johnson then?
It was stressful, but I recognize I was smart. I was a smart kid, and I was a big reader, and and I would talk to my mom, and she would say, now just mind your manners when you're in that room, So yeah, that was an important time in my life.
Did you have any siblings?
I had a brother who died when I was young, when I was in my 20s. He was 24 years old when he passed away.
Was he older, younger? Or how?
He was younger. I was 28 and he was 24 when he died.
And what was your relationship like when you were younger? Did that have any bearing on your
Well, I wouldn't say so much, because my brother was kind of a solitary person. He loved solitary pursuits. And he was more of an artist, I would say, and I was more of a,
activist.
Well, I wasn't an activist at that point as a child, but I then became an activist. And I my mother would always tell me that we were doing these things, whatever they might be, the political meetings. I mean, I would stay up late so that I could listen to what was happening when my mom was hosting these meetings at our house. And uh, and I always felt like I was one of her helpers, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad was very supportive. He used, when my mom was at her meetings, he would take me, because he was a builder, a carpenter and a craftsman. And in the evenings, he would referee basketball or baseball games, depending on what the season was. And he would take me to the games while my mother was going to her outside political meetings, you know, where a kid couldn't come. So my dad participated by father-daughter activities while my mom was out doing her stuff. So the fact that I think when the World Cafe was born, my mom, once she understood what it was and how it worked and she had participated, she and my dad, in their very first cafe, my mom had always said during all these activities related to community engagement and social responsibility and all of that, she would say, we're doing, and I would say, why are we doing this? And she would say, we're doing this because we believe in democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And when she first saw or experienced the World Cafe, she said, oh, she said, this is democracy in action.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was real democracy with a small d, you know, democratic voice and choice. And that was very meaningful to me, to think that something that we had been gifted to steward in the world was connected to something that had come as a legacy from her, and in a way from my adopted grandmother in Mexico, who had been a resistance fighter in World War II. And I
want to get to that too.
Yeah.
I had the pleasure of getting to know your mom a bit 10 years ago when she was in, I think, late 80s, and remarkable woman. I mean, we talked about wellness and all kinds of stuff. She wanted a copy of my book and stayed up and read part of it that night.
I know.
It's like, wow. How old was she? I don't even remember that. Late 80s?
90 when she passed away.
Yeah, so it must have been just a couple of years before that. Yeah. Now I want to know, did the policeman she charged with getting your guests out safely, whether they still there when the cross showed up, or?
No. The cocktail party was over by about 7. And this was just, you know, like an hour or so after that, as the darkness was falling.
Oh, they'd already left.
Yeah.
So yeah, then let's go to your adopted grandmother and that story. I've heard part of that, but I'd really like to capture that for posterity.
Well, when I was studying at Antioch College, which my mother helped find because it was a highly engagement-oriented college, Antioch. It was where you could have experiential learning, meaning you could go to do jobs. You would do 6 months of a job and then 3 months back on campus, and then 3 months of a job and 6 months back on campus. You know, it was these rotating, what we might call, experiential learning situations. And I had a biology professor, Ed Samuels, who had recently returned. I must have been like, I was right in my first or early part of my second year. I was young though. I was 17 years old. So it must have still been my first year, because I had skipped a year in school. And Ed Samuels came back with these, he had been in southern Mexico studying down there. I don't know if he was studying birds or what it was that he was studying. There were a lot of different scientists who were down in that area of Mexico, Chiapas, which is right the next state on the Guatemalan border. It shares a border with Guatemala. It's the southernmost and most indigenous Mexican state. And he told me these tales about Mexico. And I had an uncle who was a Spanish professor, and also had told me as a child unending stories about Mexico. So I had these fantasies in any case. And I said to Ed Samuels, oh, I want to go there on one of my Antioch jobs. Can you help me? And he said, well, her husband just recently died and she hates students, but I will see if she'll take you. And he wrote to her, and she really loved him, and she let me come. And so I went down on the bus all the way from Mexico. I flew to Mexico City, and then I took 24 hours on the bus going down to Chiapas. And I remember arriving at 5 o'clock in the morning and hauled my suitcase to where, dragged it from where the cab left me off to her huge front door, which was like one of those old Mexican kind of, I don't know how to describe it, you know, where there's like a huge archway door, a wooden door with a door knocker. And I recall quietly knocking on the door because it was, I sat on my suitcase for about an hour until I began to hear sounds inside there, hour and a half. And then I quietly knocked on the doorknob and I hear this scraping. And suddenly these big double doors open and this woman with a bandana over her head like this, tied, and a plaid shirt and army pants with those pockets on the sides and hobnail boots and a huge Afghan standing behind her growling. And she looks at me in the door and I'm like standing there shaking, you know, and she looks at me and she says, "Ah, you are very pretty, but you have an arrogant look about you." And that was the beginning of a love that lasted until she died in 1994.
Wow.
So that was, gosh, that was 1963. So there were 30 years where I went back and forth to Mexico. And I learned a lot from Trudy. I mean, she was a serious, I mean, she had been a serious activist. She was Swiss. She was not Jewish, but she had been very involved with the French resistance. Although she was from Switzerland, from the German-speaking area of Switzerland. And she would tell me these tales about the Second World War and mass movements and, you know, her speaking to big crowds and all that kind of stuff. And I was totally fascinated by that. And my mom came down to visit. I was also terrified of her. I mean, she was really, she was very, what my fantasy of Germanic meant in that period. She was tough, very tough. And she loved the indigenous life, and she loved the jungle better than she liked people. And so she was very, what's the word? Well, I'll give you this little story about her, and this will encapsulate Trudy. We took her at the age of 90 to receive the Global 500 Award on behalf of her lifetime of work for saving the rainforests, her environmental work, and for the rights of indigenous people. And while we were in Sweden, I said to her, "Trudy, don't you feel like your legacy has been completed with all of this?" And she says, "Hell, God damn it, no, I want to die fighting." You know, and so that was actually a moment in my own life, Jack, where I realized in that moment that I actually didn't want to die fighting. I wanted to die loving. And I feel like the work of the World Cafe is one of those small acts of love, in a way, that creates a structure in which people are enabled to build relationships through being able to experience conversations that matter at an intimate level, that allows, and I don't mean like love between men and women, but love like the human experience of mutual respect and co-evolution to happen in an honorable and integrity kind of way. And so I feel very blessed that the thread of my life, including all of that work with Cesar Chavez and the farm workers movement.
Yeah, let's
Where,
go into that. I was going to ask you about that because I know that much. I've heard of that before, but there's probably a lot of other areas I don't even know about. How you graduate from Antioch, and then what?
well, I graduated from Antioch, and I got married in my last year at Antioch. It's a 5-year program. And my former husband was a year ahead of me at Antioch, and he went to Cornell to study labor relations at the Cornell Labor Relations School. It's a very famous school at the time. William F. White and other, major labor theorists and stuff were there at Cornell at the time. And I was doing my last year at Antioch as an experiential learning, but at Cornell. So I was taking Cornell graduate classes and getting Antioch undergraduate credit for doing that, so I could graduate from Antioch. And it was, let's see, it was the fall of 1965 when I got a visitor for Thanksgiving to visit with Jerry and I at Cornell, and she had been my roommate at Antioch. And Jill Guernsey was her name, and she visited with me. She was visiting with us there, and at the time, Jerry was applying for a fellowship to go down to Bolivia to study the indigenous tin miners in Bolivia, who were actually on strike in Bolivia. And because they were indigenous people, and David was majoring in labor relations and anthropology, that seemed like a really great place for him to go do his doctoral dissertation.
I think you meant Jerry. You said David at your current.
I'm sorry. Jerry Brown was my former husband from Antioch. I married him at Antioch.
Not the Jerry Brown governor type.
Not the Jerry Brown governor. Everyone asks us that question. So Jill says to us, her father at the time was the organizing director of the AFL-CIO nationally. And she said to us, she said, "What the hell are you guys going to Bolivia for? Don't you know that the Mexican farm workers are on strike in California? Don't go to Bolivia, go to California." So we got a different grant through the American Friends Service Committee and wrote to Cesar Chavez and said, we'd like to come in the summer of 1966 to spend the summer. What we thought was just going to be to spend the summer. And with David kind of scoping things out to see, did he want to do his doctoral research there and how was it going to be? Well, that ended up us right in the middle in 1966 of perhaps the biggest summer in the history of the farm workers movement. And that was when what was called the DiGiorgio strike. The farm workers had just won the first collective bargaining, the right to have the first collective bargaining election in the history of agriculture, because in the 30s, when the Labor Relations Act was passed, farm workers, because of the political maneuvering between urban and rural, in order to get legislation, union legislation for the big urban areas, they had to give up, because of the politics of the time between the rural senators, to get them to vote for the union legislation for urban workers. They had to give up the right to organize in the fields in rural areas. That was kind of like the compromised trade. And because technically speaking, there were less workers in the fields than there were in the factories at the time, anyhow, they won and the farm workers lost out in terms of having collective bargaining rights. But because of the grape boycott and the effectiveness of that internationally, the growers were forced to come to allow an election. And so we were able to be there at the time of the very first election in the whole history of agriculture in the United States. And when the farm workers won that election, oh my God, that was the biggest, that was one of the big moments of my, even to this day at age 75 and a half, I still have chills every time I think about it. You know, it was a momentous occasion. And then we stayed with the farm workers movement for the next number of years and went to Canada to work on the boycott. And then I came and was working as the international boycott coordinator out of California. And Jerry was very active in doing all of the research of where the grapes were going. So we were a great, how would I say, we were a great work team. We were not a great marriage team, but we were a wonderful work team.
Mm-hmm. And now you had a pretty close relationship with Cesar as well, right?
Yes, I feel very blessed that I had the opportunity to travel with him around the country as his kind of communications person, be with him in many, many meetings. You know, we traveled the country in a bus with several others, you know, people helping. And Cesar was a very, very unusual person. His capacity to anticipate 4 steps ahead. I would say to him, for example, Cesar, why are we seeing this person? It doesn't seem that crucial to see this person at this moment. And he would say, no, but if we see this person is connected to this person, and that person would be able to tell us this about something critical. And he had an understanding of these relational dynamics in a very profound way. And he was a very quiet person. He would, like, we would talk about his speeches, for example, and he would tell me the things that he wanted to say. And I would write out all this stuff, you know, like detailed, and he would kind of look it over, and then he would say, well, could you just give me a 3x5 card? He would write 4 or 5 keywords from everything he'd seen there. And it would be from that he would give a quiet but mesmerizing talk, you know, right straight from his life experience and from his heart. So I had a lot of respect for Cesar and that work. It was transformative in my own life. It was where I really realized that ordinary people, all of us, ordinary people, can create extraordinary results. And that gave me a lot of faith for the rest of my life.
For younger viewers that may not even know the history of the farm workers' progress, can you outline, I know there was the grapes and the lettuce boycotts, and I was dimly aware of it. I was in medical school at the time, pretty out of everything, but
yeah, I would say, yeah, the way I would explain it now to a younger person is that Cesar Chavez was the Martin Luther King of the Mexican community, particularly of agricultural workers. But he became a symbol of Mexican American, let's call it liberation or improvement of their lives throughout the entire United States. He became the symbol of that during that period. And to this day, he is still truly honored as one of our American heroes of that era.
Mm-hmm. So the process was they got the vote, and then there were...
And then they continued to organize in many other ranches, and they're still operating today, which is 50 years later.
But they organized boycotts, and I remember Yvonne was picketing outside the Safeway in Berkeley, and she now teaches at the Cesar Chavez School in Richmond.
Yes, exactly.
The street's named for him. But what was it a separate, the lettuce was lettuce later on?
Yes,
and then
lettuce was a later iteration of that.
And
But
then
what,
they found out they were shipping it to Europe, and so they sent somebody to block that, or
yes, yes, we sent someone in that
Mhm.
period during that late 60s to Europe.
So it was really the boycotts that got people's attention
Yes,
and
yes,
got
it
the
was.
farmers
The
to,
economic pressure was
yeah.
what, and it's in a sense the same thing in principle that's happening today, where corporations decide that they're not going to advertise in certain places because, let's say, they pull their advertising from Fox News or whatever it might be. The economic pressure
Mhm.
uh, creates the will for change. Let's put it that way.
Mhm. So after your work with the farm workers, what was next in your career?
Oh my goodness. I don't ever really think of things as being the next in my career, to be honest. I really only think about what was next in my life. And
Well,
it
same.
might have happened to include work, or because I never really, there was only one other job after that that I had a real job. And that was when I went back to Florida with Jerry after in the early 1970s, when we went back to Florida where I had grown up, and Jerry began to teach at Florida International University, and I went to work in a migrant health clinic down in South Dade in the Homestead in the agricultural area there, and that that was also a community organizing job in that area. That was the poverty era. Um, that was the period of the poverty programs and the Great
Mhm.
Society and all of that. And so I was working there in that time. And then we hired a consultant to work with us, um, because, in part, because I had been organizing neighborhood people, i.e., farm workers and others from that neighborhood, which were both Latino and African American, to um, to be on the board of these organizations. And we held an election, and I think the management of the healthcare center did not think that we could get the categories of lawyer, financial person, et cetera, out of the neighborhoods. But I had scoured the neighborhoods and gone to all the churches and found candidates that met the qualifications. And therefore, we were able to kind of pack the board with both local, with neighborhood people, low income people, but we were also able to gain the votes for the professional members of the board, which uh, had not been anticipated, and that created kind of stress in the system. Let's just say, and, um, I was always a rebel, but I tried to be as charming as I could.
And you're very, very good at that.
So, um, so we hired a consultant, and I was already ready at that point. I was planning whatever was going to be the next phase of my life, and this woman took we really fell in love with each other, and she became quite a mentor to me. And it was the first time that I had ever seen working with groups outside of a movement context in which he was using easel pads and collaborative methods and conversation and that kind of thing. And I found that so relaxing. I really enjoyed it. And at the time, that was the early days of what was called the National Training Labs
Hmm.
for Applied Behavioral Science, the NTL Institute. And that's where they were doing T groups, encounter groups, team building, management by objectives. It was that early phase of management development. And she got me a scholarship. She was one of the early women in this field. And she got me a scholarship to go to these programs, which they were having during the winter in Florida. And she got me the scholarships, but there was no scholarship for room and board. So I drove up in our Volkswagen bus and parked in the parking lot of these places and would go in and eat my dessert with everybody else, pretending that I had been out on important phone calls. And just by coincidence, I sat down with a man. They were all executives. I mean, most of them, there was a few church people, and then all the rest were executives. And this man happened to be the senior vice president for Latin America for TRW Systems. And as it turned out, just by coincidence, because he asked me about my life and I didn't know enough not to tell him of what I had been doing. So I told him all about the farm workers movement and the work with migrants and all of that. And just by coincidence, he had had a farm worker nun. He was from Texas, but when they were organizing in Texas, he had had a farm worker nun living in his house because he had been supporting the farm workers movement. And he asked me, would I be interested in coming to work with their plant in Mexico? And that's how I got into this whole field of organizational development and organizational strategy. And, you know, the rest has kind of evolved over the next 30 years after that.
So you were consulting all over the places when I first met you, I think, mainly in corporate boardrooms and
yeah, I started working actually in Latin America because they needed, American companies at the time needed people who spoke Spanish who could do that same kind of work that they were doing in their US affiliates. And so I worked all over Latin America before I ever worked in the United States. And that then gave me kind of a resume. I looked good on paper, you know, so.
And other ways too.
Well, I looked good on paper and I was kind of lively and I was always the youngest one and usually the only female in the situation. I was in my, you know, late 20s and early 30s when all that began. And I spoke very good Spanish. I had been a translator for the farm workers movement and, you know, so it was charming. What can I say? It was charming. You know, I mean, people hadn't had that kind of experience if you were in, you know, Puerto Rico or Mexico or Venezuela or Colombia, you know, and so it was wonderful for me and we did good work using both my community organizing skills and the things that I had learned, you know, through the NTL work about, you know, the kind of team building and management by objectives and all of that stuff. And because having come out of movement work in social movements, it was a lot about bringing people together around a common purpose. And we did a lot of, we didn't call it facilitating in those days, running meetings, you know, and I had gotten good at that over those intense years with the farm workers movement. So it was kind of like using the same set of skills, but a large corporation to me wasn't anything different than building a movement, you know, of how you were going to bring people together in a way that they could believe in. And I never felt shy about, you know, being truthful to the executives because I didn't really care that much if they fired me. I mean, what could they do? I'd already lived on room and board and $5 a week for years. So, you know, this was gravy to me. This was fantastic. And, you know, over the many years that I did that work, it allowed us to do other good things because we could contribute to those, like the World Cafe once it got born, you know, as we were able to support that work over the years without having to be dependent on foundations.
Now, just on your personal life, how long were you and Jerry together? Where did he fit
Jerry
in?
and I were together for 11 years. And it was time. I mean, he recognized and I recognized, and to this day, we're still colleagues and friends. So it's good he found a woman that he really loves and has been with for many, many years. And, you know, I was with my former life partner who passed away. And then for the last, you know, however long it's been, 30 years with David. So
it's been 30 years. Wow.
Since 1989. Well, call it 1990.
Yeah.
John died in 1989. So if we think of 1990 and this is 2020, isn't that unbelievable?
It is. It seems like yesterday when you two met up. It's like,
I know. I was just a child.
wow. Yeah. And just for viewers, David was my adopted brother back in 73 or 74 when we were in transactional analysis marathons together and became buddies. And then we both moved to California at the same time. He helped me with starting the Wellness Center, and I followed him through his tumultuous career until he met you. And now having knowing the two of you and getting to visit you every year, except this year with the COVID crisis. So that's the connection, just for viewers, that
Yes.
there is another interview with David on the same collection. So we're building up to the discovery of the World Cafe, but are there any other steps in there that we should put in first before
No, I
reaching
think it's
the
fine.
birth point?
It was during that period, 25 years ago. So that was 1995.
Mhm.
I had started in 93. I had been asked to participate as part of a research team at MIT. They had gotten a very large grant to the Organizational Learning Center. Peter Senge and the Organizational Learning Center at MIT had gotten a very large grant to study dialogue as a vehicle for organizational effectiveness or organizational change. And I had been asked to be a part of that research team. And I was so excited because I was a big believer in dialogue and had, watched that both in the social movement work in the house meetings and the farm workers, as well as in all the years in the corporate consulting and nonprofit consulting, like these collaborative efforts through conversation. How else are we going to make meaning to take action if it's not through conversation? It's the only vehicle we have as human beings to be a part of a cycle of action that happens. It's not all talk and then action, or all talk and no action, or talk and then action. It's actually, you are in conversation and in language through that entire cycle. And so for me, being part of the Dialogue Project was like a dream come true. So we were participating in that. And then as part of the MIT Dialogue Project, we hosted in our home in Mill Valley what was called the Intellectual Capital Pioneers. We had been doing a lot of work, also just regular of our consulting work in Scandinavia. And the world's first director of intellectual capital, which later became known as knowledge management, had been named at the Skandia Corporation. And we were with Leif while we were working in Scandinavia, and he said, look, why don't we organize an interdisciplinary group in January in California? He had studied at Berkeley, and it's cold in Scandinavia in January and dark in Scandinavia in January. And so he decided that it would be just wonderful to learn about this emerging field with an interdisciplinary group, that we could invite some, he would invite some, and then we would just see what happened. And it was at the second of those dialogues in 1995 that what came to be called the World Cafe was born. And it was a total accident. It was a rainy day, and we were having, usually we would have our circle. It was at the time we were researching large circle dialogue. And there were 24 people from 7 different countries that had come in our living room. And it was the second day of the gathering. And it was raining hard. And usually we would be out on the patio eating breakfast and then come back to the circle to begin the gathering. Well, that morning, there was no way we could do that. And we had a bunch of TV tables. And I said to David, well, maybe if we just put up our little TV tables, and we had these plastic little chairs, that we could just put the chairs around the little TV tables. And then when people finish, we can just put away the TV tables and we'll make our big circle and start again, start like normal. And our graphic recorder, who does visual representations on a big mural of whatever the conversation was going to be, she came in and she says, "Oh, those tables, they really need a tablecloth." And she took off the big easel sheet, she put them over the table, and I said, "Oh, this is kind of cute." And I had some greens around the house, and I put little greens in tiny little vases that we had, and I stuck them on the 6 tables that we had put around the living room. And she said, "Oh my gosh, this is starting to look really cute. I think I'll put some markers on the table. It's starting to look like a cafe." And she makes a sign. She puts the little markers in cups, and she makes a sign for the front of the door that says, "Welcome to the Homestead Cafe." We lived on a dirt road named Homestead. You've been to that home in the valley. So people saw the sign and they came in and said, "Oh, a cafe, great." And they got their little snacks and they sat down with their coffee, and we saw that they were beginning to draw on the tablecloths, just like you would in a normal cafe. And I looked at, as the people finished eating their little snacks for breakfast, I said to David, "Oh my God, it looks like and we could tell that they were talking about the topic that had continued from the night before into the day's next work." And I said, "David, I don't think we should start the meeting." I said, "I think maybe this is the meeting." And David says, "I think so too." So we said to the people, "Just keep going." I know the topic was leadership and intellectual capital. How do you lead in a knowledge era? Well, people were so engaged that then someone in the room said, after maybe it was about 40 minutes or so, someone raised their hand and they said, "Hey, I want to know what's happening at the other tables. Why don't we leave one host at the table and send the others traveling to different tables? So if I stayed as the host, there would be people from 3 other tables coming to my table, right?" And so David and I said, "Yes, that sounds like a great idea. Let's just do it." And we did it. Well, the energy level in the room was just like, and then someone else said, "Well, hey, why don't we just leave a new host at the table and keep going?" And so we said, "Why not?" And then we realized suddenly it was like 11:30 by that time. We were shocked. We didn't even, the time had just like gone. And so we said to everybody, "Okay, we're going to stop here, but what we'd like you to do," Tommy was the graphic recorder. We asked her to put a big roll of paper out on the floor, in the middle of the floor. We asked everybody to move the tables and the chairs back and to bring their easel sheets that they had been scribbling on and put them around the edges of that big, like, picnic thing on the floor of that big white piece of paper, the long sheet of white paper of the roll, and to take a silent walk around, sensing into what was in the middle of the table, right, of the big table. The result of all these meetings, of all the various conversations that had taken place. And people did that silent walk and they noted down their stuff. And then everyone put into the center, onto the big tablecloth, their insights and discoveries. And we were astounded. I mean, we couldn't believe it. And neither could they. I mean, it was so simple. And we had no idea why this had happened. It was a completely different dynamic than happened in the large dialogue, the Bohmian dialogue work, the large circle dialogue work. And so we had with us at the time a friend from Denmark who was really a great, what we call in this work, a process designer. He was highly skilled in group things. And we completed the meeting. We had one more day of meeting, and then that following morning, he was staying with us, Finn Voltofte, and we sat down in front of the fire to try to understand what had happened, because it was so unusual and so rich in terms of the quality of the thinking that had happened there. And that was when we really began to recognize uh, that something really unusual that we needed to understand had happened. And he went back to Scandinavia to experiment. We were continuing to experiment in our corporate work and in our work in Latin America. And we would periodically get back together to share our insights. And it was at that very first time sitting in front of our fire that Finn said, and to me this was very prescient in a certain way. He said, I believe, and Finn was very tapped in, I think, to kind of other levels of, I don't know, consciousness, right? We could use that language, I think, in this, with this audience.
Yeah.
And Finn said, I believe that the World Cafe is a structure of consciousness that has been brought into the world for world service. And that the pattern that had revealed itself, he said, I think this is like nature's strategic planning process, meaning this is how new knowledge has always gotten created from the time when people went from village to village, carrying seed ideas from one village to the next, or the traveling minstrels and others that carried the news. It was the same pattern. And we had just seen that pattern operating in a room rather than over time and in organization, but that it's in a sense that same pattern that actually happens inside an organization as well. So we began, because organizations are networks of conversation. And then we began to really work on those ideas. And I later did a doctoral dissertation on the World Cafe. We went around the world asking key cafe hosts from around the globe, or clusters of them. We asked, when the magic in the middle happens, why do you think that is? And I mean, everyone knows in their life experience when you're in a conversation and like, oh my gosh, something really new is revealing itself, right? And that's how we began to distill the first principles for the design of the World Cafe, the design principles. And then we were contacted by Barrett Kohler Publishers to write a book about the World Cafe. And we continued to do that research and then began to gather detailed and intimate stories. And that's what ended up in our book, which was called The World Cafe, Shaping Our Futures Through Conversations That Matter. And then that book got translated into, and it's now like 15 languages, and the rest is history, really. It just oozed out around the world. It's amazing to us.
So when did the name shift from the Homestead Cafe to the World Cafe? How quickly did
On
that?
that day, when Finn was the one that named it, when he said,
Okay.
this is a pattern that has been born into the world for world service, and it is a world cafe. And that was when the name was born.
So the 24 people, or the other 22, 21 that you haven't named, are they still involved? Did they have much of a role in its furtherance?
Oh yes, I mean, key people were involved over many years with us, and so we're very grateful for that. At that first World Cafe, was the editor of the Harvard Business Review, and he had written an article called "What's So New About the New Economy," where he first laid out the idea that conversation was the core of the new economy, that was how people did their knowledge sharing. you know, and that then led to the work in communities of practice and a whole lot of other things. So yeah, we felt very grateful.
And I'm just remembering the older woman who died recently that David introduced.
And Dosher, our
Yeah.
elder.
Was she there too?
Oh yes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So
Oh,
we're very
wow.
grateful.
And
Oh, we've
what
been
are the current statistics? How many organizations, what is the organizational structure?
of the World Cafe.
Yeah, like,
The World Cafe does not have an organizational structure. It's a, I would say, it's an emergent phenomenon. We do have a global coordinator, but everybody is a volunteer in the World Cafe. I mean, periodically when we tithed ourselves in our corporate consulting, and everybody who worked with us on large projects, we all tithed ourselves the biblical 10% of our fees, not of our expenses, of course. And that was what was the pool that allowed us to expand the work over the years.
uh-huh. So Amy is the main,
Yes, I mean Amy is kind of like there's a team that is holding the next steps of the World Cafe, as well as a global stewardship council from the various regions in the world.
mhm.
Quite a diverse stewardship council.
So the next chapter I'd like to move into is your move to Burnsville and the wonderful farm that you took over from your parents and your vision for that. And I love going there. It's a magical place. So, and can you fill in some of that?
Well, in let me see when it was. In 1970, so now how many years is that ago? Is that 50 years ago?
Yeah.
50 years ago. Some friends of my mom and dad from Florida invited them up to visit them here in Burnsville. Many people from Florida would come to this area of North Carolina because it was cooler in the summer
Mm-hmm.
than in the mountains. This is Western North Carolina, but would be called in the United States Southern Appalachia. And my mom and dad came, and they had grown up in an urban immigrant ghetto and in South Philadelphia. And when my mom, who was a foster child, when she saw all of this green and lush and how beautiful it was, she fell in love. And they bought a small place out in Pensacola with some other friends. And then in 1973, my mom was in the local quilt shop, and a woman just walked up to her out of the blue and said, "Are you looking for land?" And my mom said, "Well, I might be." And the woman said, "Get in my truck." And my mom, being as intrepid as she was, she got in her truck and brought her to this piece of land that had an old farmhouse. And you've seen all this when you've come to visit,
Yeah.
Jack. It had the old farmhouse that had no electricity, no running water. It had this big old tobacco barn that had served as the gathering barn for the entire neighborhood as they hung tobacco, the entire hollow here. And my mom and dad said, especially when my dad saw and it had been abandoned for 10 years. It had not been lived in. So it was it was completely overgrown. But as they walked the land, my dad said, "Well, it's got good water and it's got a good barn. The house is falling down, but it's got good water and a good barn. I can do the rest." And that began their adventure here of, well, until we came 10 years ago, 40 years of them, my dad bringing stuff from houses he was renovating and putting it in here. My mom going to garage sales every Saturday during the whole year so they could then come up here and bring it. And then my dad decided that they really wanted to stay here for much more time. So it was first, like 2 months, then 3 months, then 5 months, then 6 months, then 8 months. It like kept expanding. And this really became their heart home, I would say. And my mom, I would say, given the nature of this area, she shifted her, not her political views, because to this day, I'll show you something that I got from my mom's office. You'll appreciate. Can you see this?
Yeah.
I shall not grow conservative with age. That was always prominently displayed in my mom's office. And so, but she didn't express it in that same way, because she recognized that she was in a community here where people had been isolated for centuries when they first came. People were still farming with mules, and many people didn't have electricity here or running water. And it was a very insular place, and yet a place where people really supported each other and cared for each other, and where the churches were the fundamental social unit in each neighborhood. And they recognized, even though that folks' political perspectives might not be the same as theirs, that their human values were things that they shared.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom started hosting barn parties here in the old tobacco barn before they built the hay barn and then the other cottage here. And those were open to anybody who wanted to come. And this place became well known in the community for being a place of welcome for across all traditional boundaries. And that's the way in which Millie's Mountain is known to this day. And so we have followed that tradition in being a place that is a welcoming place across these different things that often divide people.
Millie being your mother's name for viewers.
Yes.
Didn't make
Yes.
that connection. Okay. Yeah, I remember sitting out with you and David and talking about the people that would come there, and the conversations that you would create, and your vision of preserving it. And
yes. And we came here to save this farm from development, because there are developments on both sides of this hollow, and it's the only, let's call it, legacy hollow with the original families still existing here.
mm-hmm.
This close to town and this close to Asheville. So it's a really special place. And we felt, in the same way that we kind of felt that the stewardship of the World Cafe had kind of fallen by accident into our lives,
Mm-hmm.
I had never thought about this as a place for me. My former life partner who died was African American, and his children and grandchildren, I just never thought of this as my place. And yet when my mom was wanting to sell it, I had this, that it was at the summer of 2009, after my dad passed away. We brought her back here for the summer, and I had hardly spent time here. I mean, we would come for a week, and I'd be on my computer and doing whatever I was doing. But I never thought of this as an ancestral home, or that this was my place in any way. And that summer, we were over in the cottage where you all stayed. And I don't know, I woke up in the middle of the night with this, epiphany or something, that I suddenly felt completely surrounded and embraced by the love and the craftsmanship that my mom and dad had put into this place.
Oh, it really, the craftsmanship is obvious, that your dad was quite the builder.
Yes, he was. He was a really wonderful craftsman.
Mm-hmm.
And that in that moment, I realized we could never sell this farm in our lifetime, and that we needed to come, both to help my mom and to help save it from development. to save it from being sold. And and now I do feel like this place is our home. I mean, that we
Mhm.
are engaged with beloved community here. So I feel that the work with the World Cafe that was kind of linking intimacy and scale, the intimacy of a 4-person table, for example, with being part of 1,000-person group that you might be in a large conference setting, that this relationship between intimacy and scale was something that had been a defining thing in our lives. The intimacy of house meetings in the farm workers movement as being the unit that then built the large scale change efforts.
Mhm.
And this community is 1,700 people. The whole county is only 17,000. So I'm having an experience of living now in an intimate setting where my life has been lived at scale mostly, you know, in terms of the global work that we've done over the years. So I feel very satisfied, Jack, at this stage of our lives. David is 82 and I'm 76 almost. Um, David is 82 almost. And I think we've really felt now that we've finally, you know, come to a, I guess the way I might say it is we've come to a resting place in our lives.
Mhm.
And paradoxically, this time of COVID has been a very good time for our lives. I mean, we recognize how blessed we are incredibly, that we're in a relatively low density area. We're not right in the middle of a city needing to face these kinds of challenges. We have enough to eat. We have fresh water, the beauty of these mountains. And so it's been good. It's been good, you know, being in lockdown in a way for months has really enabled David and I to come to know each other at a new level and to feel really the blessings of our lives in this stage.
Any final words of wisdom about the whole experience? This is a great ending point. It's nice to have a happy ending to a story, although it's not
Well, we don't
not
know
the
yet
end
what the
end, but
ending.
the
We
end.
don't know what the ending to the story,
Right.
this story, is going to be. We really don't. For
So
us
the
or
happy
anyone
interval is
else.
what I meant. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, but and I don't even know whether it's going to have a happy ending for us, you know. But in this moment, we're
Mhm.
we're living in this parenthesis of time that feels nourishing for us, and um, and I'm grateful. I'm very grateful for that. I don't know. I guess I would say if there's a thread in my life, it's never stop learning or something. I'm
Mhm.
still an inveterate learner. You know, I'm like, oh, I'm learning something new. I'm excited about it. You know, that kind of thing. Um, and and I think the close personal relationships. I've become very interested in intimate activism or relational activism,
Mhm.
and you know what does that involve in this time and in this place. So I don't know that they're words of wisdom, but you know, life is continuing, and I feel grateful to be a part of it.
Well, and I'm so grateful that you have created what you've created and that I've been a part of it, and how the World Cafe fit into our work back in the early aughts when David facilitated 2 cafes for our summits.
Yes.
It's been wonderful. I'm going to end the recording here, and thank you so much for sharing yourself. And